We never found out who the camp belonged to. Search and rescue closed the missing persons case 14 months later. No remains, no gear, nothing. Just a site number in a logbook and a notation that said, "Origin of disturbance unknown." I've thought about that notation a lot since then. Origin of disturbance unknown. Whoever wrote that was either being very careful or very afraid. I've since come to believe it was both. This was October, 2 years ago. My brother-in-law Trent and I had been planning this elk hunt for the better part of 8 months. Okanogan Wenatchee National Forest, up in the North Cascades corridor, about 11 miles off the closest maintained trailhead. We'd done our homework the way serious hunters do, topo maps printed and laminated, satellite imagery cross-referenced with OnX, previous season reports pulled from a hunting forum we'd both followed for years. The area had good browse, reliable water from a creek drainage that funneled game movement in a consistent direction, and a saddle formation we'd identified from the maps as likely bedding ground. We'd drawn tags. We'd spent 3 weeks conditioning with loaded packs. We'd packed for 5 nights and built in a day buffer in case we needed to extend. I want to be clear about who we are before I go any further, because I know how these accounts can sound to people who haven't spent real time in backcountry. We are not first timers. We are not the kind of hunters who go out for a weekend and come back having mistaken a branch for a bear. Trent grew up hunting eastern Washington deer, elk, upland birds. His grandfather had a cattle operation outside Omak, and Trent spent childhood summers learning to read country in a way that city hunters spend decades trying to acquire. I have been doing backcountry trips since I was about 12 years old, when my dad started taking me up into the Wallowas every fall. Between the two of us, we had somewhere north of 40 combined years of wilderness time. We'd both encountered bears at close range and handled it correctly. Trent had a documented cougar encounter near Leavenworth. About 6 years prior, Cat had come within 20 feet on a logging road at dusk, and he'd backed out of there, slow and steady, without incident, exactly the way you're supposed to. We knew how to read tracks. We knew what the forest sounds like at different hours. We knew the difference between an animal moving with purpose and one that is hunting. None of that experience saved us from missing what was happening until almost too late. We left the trailhead at 5:45 in the morning on a Tuesday in early October. The temperature at the parking area was 38 degrees, clear sky with stars still visible, a light frost on the ground that made the gravel parking area look dusted with powder. We had full packs, about 55 pounds each, which included 2 rifles, bear canisters stuffed with 6 days of food, a spotting scope and tripod, 2-man bivy tent, sleeping bags rated to 15 degrees, and the full complement of navigation tools we always carried: paper topo maps, compass, handheld GPS as backup. We were prepared for the terrain and the weather. We checked the 10-day forecast 3 times in the days before leaving. We were not operating on hope. The trail we were using was lightly maintained. It sees some horse traffic in the early season, but by October it's mostly hunters, and not many of them. We'd chosen the corridor specifically because it was off the beaten path, less pressure on the game, better odds at a mature bull. We passed one other party on the way and 2 older guys heading out with empty packs and the kind of tire that comes from days in the woods rather than miles on the trail. We exchanged the standard nod and pass that hunters give each other. They didn't stop to talk, which is also normal. You don't ask a man where he's been hunting on his way out. But I remember watching them walk past me, noticing that the first man, gray beard, orange vest, frame pack with an external game bag still rolled up and unused, didn't make eye contact. He looked down at the trail. The second man glanced at our packs and then looked back up the trail toward where he'd come from, like he was checking something. Neither of them said anything. At the time, I registered this as 2 tired, skunked hunters and nothing more. I've since considered whether they knew something about that drainage and made a choice not to say it out loud. We made our first camp at a flat bench above the creek, about 7 miles in. The site was unremarkable, a flat area in the timber with a good wind block and a clear sight to the drainage below. We set up the tent, hung the bear canister from a branch 100 yards out, ate, and were in sleeping bags by 8:30. That night was entirely normal. I slept well. I heard elk bugling twice in the dark, once close, maybe 300 yards east, and once far up the ridge, which was exactly the kind of sign we'd come for. Trent was already making plans for the morning when I woke up and found him sitting outside the tent at 4 in the morning with his headlamp on, studying the map. Day 2 was a rest and reconnaissance day, which is standard practice when you've packed this deep. You don't hunt hard on day 2. You let your body recover from the pack in, and you use the time to scout, confirm your sign, and identify your stands and approaches for day 3 onward. We split up after breakfast. I went east along the ridge where I'd heard the bugle. Trent went west toward the saddle he'd been looking at on the maps. We planned to meet back at camp by 3 in the afternoon. I found what I was looking for. Fresh rubs on a stand of young firs along the ridge, bark stripped and the wood churned up, pine resin still white and wet, meaning recent. A wallow in a wet depression near the top of the drainage, edges fresh, still muddy rather than dried out. A well-used game trail angling down toward the creek bottom with tracks in the soft soil. Good-sized bull tracks mixed with cow, which told me the rut was active and the bulls were running cows in this corridor. I came back to camp at 2:30 with a solid read on where we should be sitting at first light on day 3. Trent wasn't back yet. That was fine. He had more distance to cover heading to the saddle. I started filtering water and started the camp stove for hot food. At 3:15, his radio crackled. We'd carried a pair of handheld radios for exactly this reason, staying in contact when we split up beyond voice distance. His voice was normal, even-toned, just a note of curiosity in it. "Hey, found a camp over here. Looks like someone's been here recently. Come take a look before I touch anything." I told him I was on my way. I asked for a rough bearing, and he gave me a landmark, a distinctive double-topped spruce visible from the ridge, and I set off. It took me about 40 minutes. The terrain between our camp and the saddle was broken, with a couple of ravines to cross and a section of blowdown from some old windstorm that required careful navigation. I heard him before. I saw him. He was standing at the edge of a small clearing just below the saddle, and when he heard me coming through the brush, he turned and gave me a wave. He wasn't in the clearing. He was standing at the perimeter of it, hands at his sides, looking in. That posture told me something before I even saw the sight. The camp was in a natural clearing, roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across, with old fir trees on 3 sides and an opening to the east that faced down the drainage. The first thing I noticed was the fire ring. There was an established ring, stones placed deliberately, blackened with use, not the work of one trip but of multiple. There were coals in it that were holding heat, not glowing, not active, but warm when I held my hand 8 inches above them. Someone had had a fire there in the last 12 to 18 hours. The second thing I noticed was the tent, a 3-season backpacking tent, green and gray, good quality, a brand I recognized, still staked out and standing. The rain fly was attached but not cinched on one side, hanging loose, like someone had unzipped the vestibule in a hurry and not bothered to reattach the fly cord to the stake. The third thing I noticed, and the thing that immediately made both of us slow down, was the food. A lightweight titanium pot was hanging over the fire ring on a small collapsible tripod system, the kind of ultralight setup that serious backpackers use to cook efficiently. The pot was not over active coals, just hanging there. There was food inside it. I looked in without touching it. Something that had been oatmeal or a grain-based meal, now dried out and contracted, still in the pot, crusted around the edges. And on a log beside the fire ring, an open dry bag, the kind people use to waterproof food stores, with its top unrolled and 4 or 5 energy bars scattered around it like they'd been rifled through quickly and dropped. No one who knows what they're doing leaves their food out like that in the North Cascades. Not with the bear activity in this country in October. Bears are hyperphagia at that time of year, putting on weight for winter, and they are actively seeking calorie-dense food. An open pot and scattered energy bars on a log would be gone within hours. The fact that they were still there meant the bears hadn't found it yet. The fact that they'd been left that way at all meant something had happened to the people who'd been eating from them. We should look at the tent, I said. Yeah, said Trent. Neither of us moved immediately. We stood at the edge of that clearing for close to 3 full minutes before we went in. I can't fully explain the reluctance. There was nothing I could identify, no sound, no visible threat, no specific smell at that point. But the clearing had a quality to it that I associate with places where something has gone wrong, a kind of acoustic flatness, like the normal ambient hum of a living forest, had been turned down. No bird activity in the trees around the clearing, no small animal rustle in the undergrowth, just the wind and the far sound of the creek below. Trent had his hand resting on his sidearm. I brought my rifle to low ready without making a conscious decision to do so. We went into the clearing together. The tent had two sleeping bags inside. I could see them through the mesh inner door, which was unzipped. One sleeping bag was fully unrolled. The other was half out of the tent, dragged toward the vestibule as if someone had gotten out of it fast, urgently, and the bag had come with them part way. There was a headlamp just inside the tent door, a black diamond spot, still switched on, but the battery dead. The lens had the faint residual warmth of a light that had run to zero. Whoever had left it on had not come back to turn it off. The boots stopped me cold. They were sitting just outside the tent's vestibule. A pair of men's hiking boots, size 10 or 11, set side by side with the toes pointing out, the laces loosely tied the way you tie them when you're planning to slip them back on. They were placed neatly, deliberately, not thrown or dropped or kicked off in a hurry. Set. I stood there, looking at those boots for a long time. The specific detail that lodged in my brain and would not leave was this. Whatever had happened to the people in this camp at some point before or during it, someone had taken the time to place their boots neatly side by side outside the tent door. Either that person had done it themselves before leaving the tent for some reason that made them choose to go without their boots, which is strange in October backcountry at night at any temperature below 50 degrees, or something had placed them there afterward. I did not want to think about the second option, so I focused on the rest of the site. There was a pack frame leaning against one of the firs at the edge of the clearing, empty, all straps hanging loose, no bag attached. At the edge of the creek, about 30 feet from camp, a water filter, a pump-style catadin, the orange and gray model with its intake hose trailing in the water, the pump handle extended like it had been dropped mid-use. Not set down, dropped. The hose had wrapped partially around a root at the water's edge, and the current was pulling lightly at it. It had been there long enough for a water beetle to have set up on the intake screen. And then the notebook. Trent found it under the corner of the tent's rainfly, tucked in just enough that it hadn't blown away in the night. A standard spiral-bound field notebook, the kind you can get at any outdoor store, olive green cover. He picked it up with 2 fingers, holding it at the corner, and flipped through it. Trip notes in the front, date of entry, location, weather, mileage, a gear list, a roughly hand-drawn map of the drainage, and journal entries, daily, in a handwriting that was small and precise, the kind of writing that belongs to someone who takes neat notes. He read me the last entry. I have not forgotten a word of it. Second morning. Heard something in the trees last night, south side of camp. Sounded like a person walking, big and slow. Went away after about an hour. Probably elk working the drainage. Good rubs on the ridgeline to the east. We'll check the saddle tomorrow. Woke up and the food bag had been knocked off the log. Thought it was a squirrel, but nothing was eaten. He closed the notebook. Probably elk, I said. Yeah, said Trent. The food bag hadn't been raided. Nothing had been eaten. A bear doesn't knock a food bag off a log and leave everything intact. Squirrels don't work at night. Something had knocked that bag over, and whatever it wasn't interested in the food. It was interested in whether someone would come out to investigate. I pulled out my satellite communicator, a Spot Gen 4, and composed a non-emergency message to the ranger station at the trailhead. I flagged that we had found an apparently abandoned camp with personal gear, food left out, evidence of recent occupation, but no persons present, and requested a welfare check on whoever had been permitted for this zone. I included the GPS coordinates. I sent it and got the delivery confirmation. Then we had the conversation neither of us wanted to have. It was 3:45 in the afternoon. We had less than 2 hours of usable light. Our camp was 7 miles from where we were standing, over broken terrain, with one significant ravine crossing and that blowdown section. We could not make it back before dark. Traveling in unfamiliar backcountry at night, over terrain we'd only crossed once, with packs in temperatures that were already dropping toward the mid-30s, that was a bad plan. The alternative was to stay at the site we'd found. It was already set up, it had a fire ring, we had our own gear with us, having planned for a full day in the field. We decided to stay. Looking back, I think this was the right call from a pure wilderness safety standpoint. What I didn't account for was the possibility that staying was not just a neutral decision about logistics, that by choosing to stay in that camp, we were doing exactly what something in that forest wanted us to do. We did not touch the previous campers' gear. We built the fire back up big, deliberately big, a fire you can see for a distance, fed with the driest wood we could find so it burned bright rather than smoky. We set our own camp on the north side of the clearing, away from the tent, and we established a watch rotation. I'd take first watch to midnight, Trent would sleep, then we'd swap. We both ate without much appetite and talked quietly about the hunt, about the rubs I'd found, about the plan for morning, the normal conversation of a backcountry camp. We were doing the thing that competent people do when something feels wrong. We were imposing normalcy over it. The first 3 hours of darkness were uneventful. I heard the creek. I heard the wind in the high canopy above the clearing. Twice I heard elk far up the ridge, and once what I was fairly sure was a barred owl in the timber to the north. Nothing came near the camp. Trent went to sleep at 9, and I sat on a log with my back to the fire and my face toward the tree line, rifle across my lap, safety on, watching the darkness between the trunks. At 11:17, I know the exact time because I checked my watch at the sound I smelled something. It came without warning or buildup. One moment the air smelled like wood smoke and cold for a needle and the faint mineral smell of the creek. The next moment it smelled like something else entirely. The closest I can come to describing it is wet animal underlaid with something sweet and wrong, like a large dead thing that had been in water for several days and was now very close. Not the clean decay of an animal that's been lying in the cold. That smell is almost familiar, organic, a smell the woods produces constantly. This was something that had absorbed organic smells and was wearing them over something that was not organic, not quite right, like a costume made of the right materials but cut for a different shape. I stood up from the log. The fire was still strong. I left my headlamp off. You keep better night vision without artificial light, and the fire was giving me adequate illumination for the immediate camp area. The tree line around the clearing was dark, but not black. There was a partial moon somewhere behind high cloud, giving just enough ambient light that I could make out the shapes of the first rank of trees. Anything standing in those trees, pressed against a trunk or between root masses, would be very hard to see. I knew this. I turned slowly, scanning every sector of the tree line in sequence, the way you scan open country with binoculars, methodical, overlapping, no gaps. I saw nothing. I put my hand on my rifle and clicked off the safety. Then it stepped. One footstep, south side of the clearing, 40 feet out in the timber, maybe less. The sound was not what I expected, not a branch snap, not a rustle of brush, not the explosive crack of a startled animal. It was the sound of a very large amount of weight settling deliberately onto frozen ground. A deep compression. One step, placed carefully, and then silence. Something that was moving slowly and choosing where to put its feet. Something that was not in a hurry. And it stopped. I awoke Trent with two firm squeezes to the shoulder, our pre-established signal for get up quiet. He was awake in under 2 seconds. His hand went to his sidearm before his eyes were fully open. I pointed south. He nodded. He'd smelled it too. We positioned ourselves at the north edge of the fire's light, backs to the flames, rifles and sidearm oriented toward the south tree line. The fire behind us meant we could see into the darkness better than whatever was in the timber could see us. We were lit from behind, not silhouetted against black. I don't know if it mattered. 4 minutes passed, maybe 5, long enough that I began to seriously question myself. Long enough that the mind starts to offer alternative explanations: elk, bear, the fire popping and playing tricks on acoustics. Long enough that Trent let out a controlled breath and I could see him recalibrate. It took another step. Same sound, same deliberate wait, but closer, significantly closer, 25, 30 feet from the tree line, and then it stopped again. Complete stillness. Not the stillness of an animal that's been startled and is waiting to bolt. The stillness of something that is choosing to be still, patient, assessing. I have heard every large animal in the Pacific Northwest woods at night. I know what a bear sounds like approaching camp, the shuffle and huff, the branch cracking carelessness of an animal that relies on size rather than stealth, the distinctive smell of musk and berry and fish that travels ahead of them. I know what elk sound like in the dark, the measured, heavy footfall, the occasional teeth grinding, the way they'll stand in one place for minutes at a time, but always with a quality of grazing inattention, not focus. What I was hearing in the timber south of that clearing had the weight of a large animal and none of the qualities of one. It was moving with intention. It was choosing each step. It was tracking something or it was waiting for something. The smell intensified, and then it made the sound. I have described this to several people over the past 2 years, and I have not been able to make anyone fully understand it who wasn't there. The closest I can come is this. It was a human voice attempting to produce a human sound without understanding what makes human sound human. It had the resonance and the rough frequency range of a male voice, low, substantial, carrying, but the quality of it was wrong in the same fundamental way that a recording of speech played at slightly wrong speed is wrong. The breath behind it was wrong. The shaping of it was wrong. It was not a word. It was the shape of a word, or the impression of one, produced by something that had heard human speech and was trying to reproduce the architecture of it without understanding what lived inside that architecture. It came once, from the south tree line, low and deliberate. Trent fired one round, 9 millimeter, into the south tree line in the direction of the sound. The report in that small clearing was physically enormous, the kind of concussive crack that hits your chest as much as your ears, and the echo off the surrounding timber came back in layers. Then there was a crash. Not the explosive bolt of a startled deer, which is all speed and no weight. Not a bear's heavy galumphing run. This was something large, moving fast through dense timber, hitting brush and root masses and small trunks in the dark, but moving with a direction and a purpose that suggested it knew exactly where it was going. It went north along the ridge. It moved for about 30 seconds and then the sound of it was gone, swallowed by distance and the wind. We kept the fire burning through the rest of the night. Neither of us slept. We did not hear it again, did not smell it again. At first light, 5:40 in the morning, the sky going from black to dark gray to the flat silver of a cloudy dawn, we packed. We did not go back to our original camp. We pulled the tent stakes from the abandoned camp, took the notebook, and we hiked straight out to the trailhead, all 11 miles, arriving at the truck at just past 1 in the afternoon. The ranger station was staffed when we arrived. We gave a full statement to a ranger named Collins, a woman in her mid-40s, short, silver-streaked hair, the practiced calm of someone who has spent 20 years taking reports in backcountry country. She wrote everything down, without interrupting. She asked questions that told me she knew what categories of event she was sorting this into. When I described the sound, the almost voice, she set her pen down for a moment. She wrote something and circled it and didn't show us what it was. She asked for the GPS coordinates of the site. She asked whether we had moved any of the gear. She asked Trent at what angle he'd fired and whether he'd observed any physical evidence of a strike. He had no blood, no tissue, no struck wood that he could identify in the immediate aftermath. She noted that. She noted it like it confirmed something. Search and rescue went in 4 days later with a full team. They found the camp exactly as we described it. They found no persons. They documented 2 sets of boot prints entering the camp from the north, consistent with the 2 missing permit holders for that zone, and then no prints leaving, as if the people who had walked in had simply stopped at the edge of that clearing and ceased to exist as physical beings who left marks on ground. Collins called me 3 weeks after we filed the report. She spoke briefly and precisely, the way field personnel speak when they're giving you real information they can't officially give you. She told me the case was being classified as a missing persons, that SAR had done a full sweep of the drainage and found nothing, that the case would remain open. And then she told me the thing I have thought about every day since. She said there had been similar events in that drainage over the past 3 seasons. Different sites, same pattern, camps found staged warm fire, food left out, gear placed carefully with no persons present. She said they'd cross-referenced the gear inventories and that some of the items in the camp we'd found had been registered to a different party that had gone missing 2 seasons prior, 40 miles north, in a different drainage. The tent, the pack frame, the boots. The boots had come from somewhere else. They'd been placed there. The camp had been assembled from pieces of other missing persons' gear and set up to look inhabited. The coals had been warm because something had built that fire, maintained it, and left it burning for someone to find. She let that information settle for a moment before she said, "It's learning what draws people in, and it's getting better at building the lure." Then she told me not to go back to that trail for at least a year. She did not phrase it as a suggestion. I asked her one more question before she ended the call. I asked her if the sound Trent and I had heard, the almost voice, had been described by other witnesses. And there was a pause that lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. 3 of the 5 previous witnesses described a vocalization, she said. Each described it differently. One said it sounded like someone calling for help from far away. One said it sounded like a large animal attempting to growl. One said it sounded like nothing they had a word for. She paused again. "You're the first to describe it as trying to form a word." She hung up after that. I don't think she meant it as a conclusion. I think she was done talking about it. The official report says wildlife encounter, origin of disturbance unknown. 14 months later, no remains, no gear from the current missing persons, no resolution. The permit zone for that drainage was quietly reduced by 2/3 the following season. The Ranger District newsletter included a brief advisory about elevated wildlife activity in the Okanogan corridor that fall, recommending hunters in the area exercise additional caution with food storage and campsiting. No specific location was named. No specific animal was named. If you didn't know what you were reading, you would take it as a standard bear advisory and think nothing of it. Here's what I will tell you, and I'll say it plainly. If you find a camp in the deep backcountry that looks recently used but has no people in it, coals still warm, food still out, gear still standing, do not stay in it. Do not make the mistake Trent and I made, assuming it was a gift from the woods, a practical solution to a logistical problem. In certain parts of the deep Cascades and drainages that don't see much foot traffic, a warm fire in an empty camp is not an accident or someone's bad luck. It is a construction. It is something that has spent seasons learning what human beings move toward when they are cold and tired and a long way from the road. It builds the thing you want to find, and then it waits for you to walk into the clearing. Don't walk in, keep moving. Don't stop until you have your own fire, your own sight, your own ground. And if you pass two tired hunters coming out of a drainage with empty packs and eyes that won't meet yours, stop them. Ask them what they saw. They might tell you, I could see it moving on the far bank, clear as anything in my binoculars. But every time the water dropped to a whisper, it stopped completely. It wasn't afraid of me seeing it. It just didn't want me to hear it coming. I need to start by telling you something about the Ho River, because if you've never been to Olympic Peninsula, you might not understand the scale of what I'm talking about, and the scale matters for why what I saw was possible at all. The Ho is a glacial river fed by snowmelt and rain runoff from the Olympic Mountains, running fast and wide through one of the only temperate rainforests in the continental United States. The old growth on both banks is some of the densest, most ancient forest in North America, Sitka spruce and western red cedar with trunks wider than most living rooms, draped in so much moss. They look like something assembled by the forest itself rather than grown. The canopy is thick enough in places that it's genuinely dim at noon on a clear October day. The undergrowth is chest-high fern and devil's club and vine maple packed tight enough that moving off trail more than a few yards from the bank becomes slow, deliberate work. You don't push through that country. You navigate it. The river itself is loud. That is the specific thing I need you to understand, because everything that happened to me on that stretch depends on it. When the Ho is running full, which it usually is in late September and into October, after the summer drawdown and before the full autumn rains peak, the sound of it fills the entire valley. It is not the babbling of a small stream. It is not the white noise of a medium river. It is a sustained physical roar that occupies the entire soundscape, that you feel in your sternum as much as hear with your ears, that swallows other sound the way fog swallows distance. You can shout at someone 5 feet away and they'll catch maybe half your words. You can walk through heavy brush 10 feet from a standing person and they will not hear your footsteps. Something out there had figured this out, and it had been using it for longer than I'd been fishing that stretch. My name does not matter. I am 43 years old. I live in western Washington, about 2 hours from the peninsula, which means I have made that drive more times than I can count the long run down Highway 101 past Sequim and Port Angeles and into the deep green tunnel of the National Park corridor, the light changing as you drop under the canopy, the temperature dropping 2 or 3 degrees even in summer. That drive always felt like a transition, like passing through something. I know now that I was right about that, just not in the way I meant. I've been fly fishing for steelhead and sea run cutthroat on Olympic Peninsula rivers since my mid-20s. I know that river the way you know your own neighborhood, the feel of the gravel bars underfoot, which bends hold fish in which water temperatures, where the log jams are, which channels cut deep and which are safe to wade at knee height. I had been coming to this specific section of the Hobe backcountry for 6 consecutive seasons. I knew the river, or I thought I did. This particular trip was a solo 4-day outing in early October. My usual fishing partner, a man named Ray, who I've known since college, had a knee surgery that fall that kept him out of the field for the entire season. I went alone without much concern. I'd done solo trips on this water before. I had a satellite communicator, a spot device that I'd registered with my emergency contact, my older brother, who had my full itinerary, including planned campsites and expected check-in times. I had bear spray clipped to the outside of my pack. I had a fixed blade knife. I had a headlamp and a backup headlamp. I was not underprepared, and I was not cavalier about being alone in that country. I simply knew the terrain well enough that the risk felt manageable. The first 3 days were entirely normal, and I want to say that clearly because I think it matters for understanding what happened on the fourth. Nothing in those 3 days gave me any reason to be on guard. Nothing felt wrong. The country was doing exactly what it always does in October: big, quiet, indifferent, gorgeous, in the way that old growth is gorgeous, which is to say, not pretty exactly, but ancient. The kind of beauty that has nothing to do with you and does not care whether you notice it. I made camp at a gravel bar 2 miles from the road access point in a wide open flat spot with clear sight lines in every direction, the kind of camp that makes you feel exposed rather than sheltered, which is exactly what you want in bear country. I fished the lower section of my planned water the first day, the upper section the second, and rested and reorganized on the third. Caught and released several fish. Saw a black bear working the far bank on the second afternoon, doing what bears do in October, methodically turning rocks and tearing apart spawned out salmon carcasses, moving slowly down the bank with its nose down, completely indifferent to my presence across the water. Normal, expected, the kind of wildlife encounter that reminds you that you're a visitor in functioning country. The morning this started was the fourth day, my last full day before the hike out. I was up before first light, which in early October on the peninsula means rising around 5 in the morning into darkness and cold, dressing in layers in the tent, getting the camp stove going for coffee before I could fully think straight. Temperature was in the low 40s. There was ground fog sitting in the fern understory along the bank, the kind of fog that doesn't lift until mid-morning, that turns the old growth into something that looks painted rather than real. I drank my coffee standing at the edge of the gravel bar, listening to the river, which was running at a medium level, not peak volume, but substantial. The kind of flow that had settled after several clear days following a rain, still carrying runoff but starting to clarify. I was planning to work a long run about a quarter mile downstream from camp. I'd identified it on the second day and had been saving it. It was the kind of water that looked exactly right, a deep seam along the far bank where the current deflected off a partially submerged log jam with a long, slow tail out below it that would hold resting fish, the kind of lie that a serious steelhead angler sees and wants to approach carefully, not burn on a tired afternoon when the light is wrong. I had been waiting for the right morning, and the fourth day, with the fog and the medium water and the clear skylight coming in from the east, felt like the right morning. I rigged up at camp and walked the bank downstream to the run. I waded in from the near side gravel bar, got myself positioned in thigh-deep water about two-thirds of the way across, and started working the far seam with a swinging fly. The current was cold enough that I could feel it through my waders on my legs. The fog was burning off slowly above the canopy. The light coming through the trees on the far bank was the kind of early morning light that makes everything look like it's lit from within. I'd been at it for about an hour and a half when I noticed the shape. It was on the far bank, back in the trees, in the shadow of a big Sitka spruce that had dropped a lower limb. At some point, the stump of the limb was still there, chest height, and the shape was standing just behind it, in the gap between the spruce trunk and the next tree over. I saw it in my peripheral vision first, the way you always see things that are trying not to be seen, not as a moving object, but as a vertical interruption in a space that should have been horizontal. I turned to look directly at it, and it was still there, tall, upright, still. I told myself it was a heron. Great blue herons are common on that river. They stand exactly like that, perfectly still, vertical, patient, waiting. But it was in the trees, not at the water's edge, and it was too tall even for a heron, which already stands nearly 4 feet. And the proportions were wrong even at that distance, even through the morning fog. Too much mass through the torso. No visible neck extension, just a tall, dense, upright shape standing very still in the shadows between two old-growth trees. I kept fishing. I told myself it was another angler working the far bank, which happens. There are a few access points on that side that most people don't know about, and occasionally you encounter someone coming from the other direction. Anglers stand still. They stand in the trees sometimes, watching a pool before they approach it. I told myself this, and I kept casting, and the shape did not move for the next 20 minutes, and I almost convinced myself it was a trick of shadow and fog and a mind that had been alone for 4 days. Then the river dropped. It does this in the morning during the fall drawdown, a period usually lasting anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes, where the flow eases slightly. The cause is a complex interaction of overnight temperature, upstream snowmelt timing, and drainage basin hydrology that I only partially understand. What I know from 6 years on that water is that it happens, that it's predictable in a general sense, and that when it happens, you can suddenly hear things you couldn't hear before. Bird calls from the canopy, your own waders pushing water, wind moving through the fern on the bank behind you. The second the river dropped in volume, the shape stopped. I want to be precise about what I mean. The shape had been still for 20 minutes, but there is a difference between a thing that is holding a position and a thing that is just frozen. I caught the very end of a movement, a shift, a repositioning, the kind of micro adjustment a person makes when they've been standing still too long and their weight has shifted forward and they correct it. It was in the middle of that adjustment when the river noise decreased, and the instant the noise decreased, it locked completely. Not gradual stillness, instantaneous. I stood in the water with my line going slack in the current, and I stared at that shape for a long time. The river stayed quiet for about 4 minutes. The shape did not move at all during those 4 minutes. Not a shift, not a breath, not a lean. Then the flow picked back up a micro surge, the kind that comes and goes constantly on glacial rivers as upstream conditions fluctuate, and the shape started moving again, walking, moving through the trees, parallel to the river, moving at a pace that I can only describe as deliberate, not fast, not slow, the pace of something that knows where it's going and is not in a hurry to get there, moving in my direction. I got out of the water. I did it calmly, the way you get out of water when you've decided you're done fishing, and not because you're afraid. I reeled in my line. I stowed my fly. I waded back to the near side gravel bar and stepped out. I did this partly because I didn't want to be standing thigh deep in moving water if I needed to move quickly, and partly because I needed a moment to think clearly on solid ground. I stood on the bar and I watched the far bank. The shape had stopped again, because when I'd stepped out of the main channel and moved up onto the gravel bar, I'd moved into a section of the bank that was partially sheltered from the main river noise by a low gravel ridge behind me. The ambient sound level where I was standing had dropped, and whatever was on the far bank had registered that and stopped. It was standing about 50 feet back in the tree line. I picked up my binoculars, a compact pair of Vortex 10s that I carry in my vest, and I looked. I need to be careful about how I describe what I saw through those binoculars because I want to be accurate and not dramatic. I was looking at something through river fog and old growth shadow across 60 feet of water and 50 feet of timber understory. What I could see clearly was limited. What I could see clearly was this. It was upright, bipedal, and tall. I would estimate 7 feet, possibly more, with the caveat that distance and fog make estimation unreliable. It was not a bear on its hind legs. I have seen bears stand many times, and the posture is unmistakable, the head forward, the front paws hanging, the general impression of an animal that is temporarily borrowing a posture that belongs to something else. This was not that. This was the posture of something that stood upright as its natural state. The proportions were wrong in ways that I noticed cumulatively rather than all at once. The torso too long relative to the legs, the shoulders too narrow relative to the overall mass, the arms hanging too low, almost to the knee. And it was not moving. It was watching me. I know that sounds like something I'm projecting. I know that from 60 feet through binoculars and fog, claiming that something was watching me specifically is a hard thing to substantiate. But everything about the way it had been behaving, the parallel tracking, the precise synchronization with the river noise, the stopping when the sound dropped, everything about it indicated an awareness of me specifically, an attention directed at me, a patience that was not random. It was not coincidentally near me. It was near me because it had chosen to be. I sent a message on my satellite communicator. I sent it to my brother, noting my GPS coordinates and describing what I was observing. I included the detail about the river noise and the synchronization because even then, standing on that gravel bar with something on the far bank watching me, I understood that this detail was the most important part of what I was seeing. Not the size of the thing, not the wrong proportions, the behavior, the fact that it had learned to use sound cover as a tool. I stayed on the open gravel bar. I did not go back toward camp, which would have meant moving into the partial tree cover along the bank trail. I stayed in the open. That felt instinctively correct, and I still believe it was the right call. Whatever was on the far bank had been moving through dense timber with apparent ease and familiarity. The open gravel was not its terrain. The open gravel was mine. I want to describe what that waiting felt like because I think the texture of it matters and I don't want to skip past it in the interest of getting to the more dramatic parts. It wasn't a continuous state of terror. That's not how this kind of thing works, in my experience. What it was is this: a sustained, low level wrongness that sat underneath everything I did and thought for the entire time I was on that bar. I ate a granola bar from my vest pocket. I drank water from my bottle. I sat down on a flat rock at one point because my legs were tired from 2 hours of waiting. I did all of these ordinary things while something across the river watched me from the timber and timed its movements to the fluctuations in the current. The ordinary and the wrong existed simultaneously, and the combination of the two was in some ways harder to manage than straightforward fear would have been. I also spent a significant amount of that time trying to logic my way out of what I was seeing. That's a natural response, and I don't think it reflects poorly on me. I think it's what any rational person does when confronted with something that doesn't fit the available categories. I went through every large animal in the Olympic Peninsula ecosystem. Black bear, wrong posture, wrong movement pattern. Bears don't track parallel to a water source for 2 hours, and they don't synchronize their movement to noise levels. Roosevelt elk, possible size, but elk don't hold static positions in deep timber for extended periods, and the upright bipedal posture I was seeing through the binoculars was unambiguous. Cougar, far too large, and cougars don't move with this kind of open deliberateness. They compress and slink and use terrain for concealment in a way that is visually very different from what I was watching. Another person, I held on to this one the longest because it was the most comfortable explanation, but no human being produces the proportional wrongness I was seeing, and no human being tracks a stranger's movements along a river for 2 hours by synchronizing their footsteps to natural fluctuations in ambient sound. Not accidentally, not as coincidence. I ran out of categories somewhere around the 45-minute mark. After that, I stopped trying to categorize it and just watched it. Something else happened in that time that I haven't mentioned yet and should. The smell reached me around noon when the wind shifted to come off the far bank rather than up the valley. I've described this smell in conversation with other people, and I've read enough accounts online to know that others have described it too. There's a consistency to the descriptions that I find either deeply reassuring or deeply troubling depending on my mood. It is organic but wrong. Wet animal layered over something older and sweeter, like a large dead thing that has been in cold water long enough that the surface decay has stabilized but the deep rot is still active. It came and went in pulses as the wind shifted. It was not subtle. It was the kind of smell that makes your body react before your mind has processed it, a primitive flinch, a quickening, something below the level of conscious thought that says this is a predator smell and you are prey. The smell did not go away for the rest of the time I was on that bar. For the next 2 hours, I watched it and it watched me. It moved 4 more times over the course of those 2 hours, each movement timed precisely to surges in the river noise. I started tracking the surges consciously, the way you track tide cycles on tidal water, learning the rhythm, anticipating the peaks. What I found was that the surges were irregular, driven by upstream conditions I had no way to predict. But whatever was across the water was reading them in real time, responding to each volume increase within seconds, moving the moment the sound cover was adequate and stopping the instant it dropped. The speed of that response was one of the things that unsettled me most. A person using sound cover deliberately would still have a reaction time, a beat of assessment, a conscious decision to move. What I was watching had essentially no lag between the noise increasing and the movement starting. Either it was monitoring the acoustic environment continuously at a level below deliberate thought, or had been doing this long enough that the behavior had become completely automatic. Each time it moved, it closed ground, not a lot of ground, but consistent ground, always in my direction along the bank, always stopping the instant the noise dropped back. By early afternoon, it had worked its way to a position almost directly across from where I was standing, 60 to 70 feet back in the tree line. I could see it more clearly now that the fog had fully lifted, though the old growth shadow on that bank was still deep and the understory was thick enough to fragment any clean view. At around 2 in the afternoon, it came to the bank. It walked out of the tree line and stood at the very edge of the water. Not in the water, at the edge of it, on the bank, where the gravel met the current. It stood there, and it looked across at me, and I looked back at it through my binoculars, and we were separated by 70 feet of fast, cold, glacial river. I'll describe what I saw as plainly as I can. It was tall. The wrong proportions I had noticed from a distance were correct and were more pronounced up close. The arms genuinely reached to near the knee, which on a standing human figure would represent a significant anatomical deviation. The head was large relative to the neck. The face, what I could see of it at that distance, was oriented toward me, but I could not make out features clearly enough to describe them, and I will not invent details I did not actually see. It was standing in full daylight, thin October light, the sun low in the south behind me, and it did not flinch from the exposure. It was not trying to hide anymore. What I noticed most, standing there, looking at it across the water, was the stillness. The river was loud between us. It should have been using that noise, moving, closing ground the way it had been doing all morning. Instead, it was completely still. And I had the specific, unshakable impression, which I recognize as subjective and unprovable, and which I nonetheless stand behind completely, that the stillness was a choice. That it had stopped using the river noise, not because the noise had dropped, but because it had decided to let me see it, that it was showing me something. That the patience I'd been watching all morning had culminated in this moment of deliberate, open presence, and that what it was communicating, in whatever way a thing like that communicates, was that it had been there the entire time, that it had always known where I was, and that the only reason I was still on the gravel bar was that it had decided I should be. I do not know how long we stood like that. My best estimate is 3 minutes. Then it stepped back from the bank into the tree line and was gone. Not a crash, not a run. One step back into the shadow and then nothing, as if the forest had simply absorbed it. I broke camp in 40 minutes. I packed everything, loaded my pack, and I hiked out in the last 2 hours of daylight. The trail back to the road follows the river closely, staying on the near bank, and I checked the far bank constantly for the entire 2 miles. I heard at once a single heavy footstep in the timber on the far side, timed to a surge in the river noise, roughly parallel to my position on the trail. I did not see it again, but I heard that one step and I knew it was still there, still tracking, still using the water. I got to the road at dusk. The parking area was empty except for my truck. I was the only permit holder in that section that week. I sat in the driver's seat with the doors locked and the windows up, and I watched the tree line at the edge of the road for a long time before I started the engine. The river was audible even from the parking area, a low, sustained roar through the trees. I wondered if something was moving in those trees right now, using the sound, and I decided I did not need to know the answer to that question tonight. I started the truck and I drove. The next morning, I went to the Olympic National Park Visitor Center at the Hoh Rainforest entrance and I filed a report. The ranger who took it was a young man, mid-30s, who wrote everything down carefully and asked clarifying questions without any of the polite skepticism I'd been expecting. When I described the synchronization with the river noise, the precise stopping and starting time to the fluctuations in volume, he set his pen down on the desk. "Which section of the river?" he asked. I gave him the approximate location. He wrote something down that I couldn't read from where I was sitting, and then he looked back up. "We've had two other reports from that stretch in the past 3 seasons," he said. "One from a group of 4 backpackers who camped on the near bank gravel bar for 2 nights. One from a solo kayaker who was running the upper section." He paused. "The kayaker described the same behavior, said it moved when the water was loud and stopped when it wasn't. He did not say what he thought it was. He gave me a case number and told me they would flag the area for increased ranger patrol. He said this in a tone that suggested he understood patrolling that stretch of old growth would not accomplish very much. I asked him whether anyone had been injured in the other incidents. He said no. He said both parties had exited the area without direct contact. And then he said something that I have thought about many times since. Whatever it doesn't seem to want contact. It seems to want proximity. Those are different things, and we don't fully understand what the distinction means yet. I've been back to the peninsula twice since that trip. Different river, different drainage, farther south. The fishing is good down there. I haven't seen anything, but I fish differently now. I pay attention to the sound of the water the way I never had to before. When the river drops in volume, I stop casting and I look around. I check both banks. I check the tree line, and if I see something standing still in the timber across the water that wasn't there a moment ago, something tall, something that was moving while the river was loud, I reel in. I get out of the water and I stay in the open. The Hoh is a beautiful river. I'm not telling you to stay off it. I'm telling you to listen to it, not just for the sounds it makes, but for the sounds it's covering. Those are two very different things, and something out there in that old growth has known the difference for a long time, long enough to have refined it into a method. Long enough that 2 other people filed reports about it before I did, and the ranger who took my report had a category ready for it before I finished my sentence. That is not the profile of something new. That is the profile of something patient. The ranger station logged it as a wildlife encounter. That's the official record. But the ranger who took my statement walked me out to my truck and said one thing before I left. "Don't come back to this trail for at least a season, and don't bring the dog." Before I tell you what happened on that trail, I need to tell you about Coda, because if you don't understand the dog, you won't understand why what he did scared me as much as it did. Coda is an 8-year-old Belgian Malinois mix, 65 pounds, all muscle, built like something engineered rather than bred. His previous owner was a guy I went to college with who'd gotten him as a working dog prospect and then realized his downtown apartment and his 60-hour work weeks were not compatible with the Malinois' needs. I adopted Coda when he was 2. In the 6 years since, he has hiked somewhere north of 3,000 miles with me across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. He has been in the presence of black bears at distances that would make most people's legs stop working. He has encountered territorial moose on a trail in the Cascades and held a perfect heel while I backed us both out of the situation slowly. He has been charged by a male elk during the rut, not a bluff charge, a committed one, and he stood his ground beside me without making a sound, without breaking position, until the elk veered off. He has, on one memorable occasion, taken a face full of porcupine quills and allowed me to remove every single one of them with pliers without biting me once. He is not a nervous dog. He is not a reactive dog. He is not a dog that spooks at shadows or stumps or the smell of something dead in the brush. He is the steadiest animal I have ever known, and I have trusted his read on terrain and situation more times than I can count because he has never once been wrong. He refused to pass that bend in the trail on 3 consecutive mornings, and the way he refused, the stillness of it, the deliberateness of it, the way he turned and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as a warning told me that whatever was on the other side of that bend was something he had made a considered judgment about and had decided was not something we were going to walk toward. I should have listened the first time. The trail is in the back country of Mount Rainier National Park, accessed through a trailhead off the Carbon River Road in the northwest corner of the park. It's an out and back that climbs through old growth Douglas fir and western red cedar for the first 3 miles, and then opens up into subalpine meadow and eventually crests a ridge with a view of the northwest face of the mountain that is one of the better kept secrets in a park full of famous views. Most visitors to Rainier don't get this far. The trail is moderately maintained, marked but not manicured, the kind of route that self-selects for people who know what they're doing. I'd done sections of it probably a dozen times over the past 4 years, in all seasons, always with Coda. This trip was a 3-day backpacking trip in late September, just me and the dog. My wife had the full itinerary. I was carrying a satellite communicator. I had bear spray, a fixed blade knife, a headlamp with 2 sets of backup batteries, and enough food for 4 days in case I needed to extend. I had done everything right in terms of preparation. I want to be clear about that because what happened was not a result of carelessness. The first night was clean. I made camp at a flat site near a small lake at about the 8 mile mark, a designated backcountry site with a bear wire already strung between 2 big firs, which I used for my food bag. The temperature dropped to around 35 degrees overnight, which is normal for late September at that elevation, and I slept well in a 15-degree bag with Coda curled against my legs the way he does when the nights get cold. I heard things in the dark, the way you always do in that country, branches settling, wind moving through the canopy. Once, what sounded like something large stepping in the brush, maybe 150 yards north of camp. Coda raised his head at that sound, listened for about 30 seconds, and then put his head back down. Whatever it was, he'd assessed it and dismissed it. That's how I knew it was nothing. Day 2, I did the full ridge, run up to the crest, out along the exposed ridge for about a mile, back down a different route through a meadow drainage that feeds into the lake basin. Beautiful day, clear sky, the kind of late September light that makes everything in the Cascades look overexposed and perfect. I saw a black bear from a distance on the meadow traverse, maybe 200 yards, moving uphill away from me without any interest in my presence. Coda watched it the way he watches all bears alert, tracking perfectly still, and then moved on when it disappeared into the timber. Normal, completely normal. We were back at camp by 4 in the afternoon, ate, slept. The second night was also largely quiet. I say largely because there was one thing. Around 1 in the morning, I woke briefly to the sound of Coda shifting position in the tent, which he does occasionally when he hears something outside. I lay still and listened. There was a sound from the north of camp, a single heavy footstep in the brush, the kind of deep compression that a large animal makes on wet ground. Then nothing. Coda raised his head, his ears moving to track the direction of the sound, and then after maybe 20 or 30 seconds, he lowered his head back to his paws and closed his eyes. I remember thinking, half asleep, that he'd handled it, that whatever it was, he'd assessed it and filed it under not a concern. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter and went back to sleep. I have thought about that moment every day since. Because what I understand now, what the Ranger's comment eventually made me understand, is that I was reading Coda's behavior as a dismissal when it was actually something else. He didn't go back to sleep because the sound was nothing. He went back to sleep because whatever made that sound had already spent enough time near our camp over enough hours of darkness that it had crossed some threshold in Coda's read of it. It had gone from unknown to familiar, and in Coda's framework, familiar but not threatening meant he didn't need to wake me. The thing had been at our camp long enough and quietly enough for a trained working dog to have gotten used to it. I did not know that yet. On day 3, I found out later. Day 3 is when it started. I was breaking camp, planning to hike out, and the route back to the trailhead took us through the old growth section we'd come in on the lower 3 miles, the dense timber below the subalpine zone. We'd been on this trail 2 days before without any issue. I wasn't thinking about it any differently than I would any other stretch of trail I'd covered before. About 4 miles from the trailhead, the trail passes a section where a massive old Douglas fir had blown down across an adjacent gully years ago. The trunk is still there, 8 feet in diameter, moss covered, more or less horizontal across the gully below trail level. The trail bends around the head of that gully, so there's a 40-foot section where you're walking with the gully falling away on your left and dense standing timber close on your right, shadowed, quiet. The old growth in there is thick enough that the light is dim even at midday. Coda stopped at the entrance to that bend. I was walking behind him. I usually let him range 5 or 10 yards ahead on familiar terrain, and I pulled up when he did. He was standing at the very beginning of the bending section, ears forward and hard, head lowered slightly, staring down the trail into the shadowed section. I waited for him to move. He didn't. I came up alongside him and looked down the trail myself. I saw nothing unusual. The trail looked exactly like every other section of old growth trail we'd covered that morning. Fern, root masses, sword fern, shadows, the occasional patch of light breaking through the canopy far above. Nothing moving. No sound except the far drip of water somewhere below in the gully, and the wind high in the canopy. No smell I could identify. Coda turned and looked at me. I have spent 6 years learning to read this dog, and what I saw in that look was not fear. Fear in a Malinois looks different. It's active, physical, a loading of energy that wants to discharge somewhere. What I saw was more considered than that. It was the look of an animal that has processed available information and arrived at a conclusion and is communicating that conclusion as clearly as a dog can communicate anything. The conclusion was, no, not that way. Something is wrong in that direction, and I am telling you about it. I clipped his lead. I brought him to heel. We went through the bend together, me watching the timber on both sides, him pressed tight against my left leg. Going through it with him that way, him against my leg, me moving slowly, watching the timber, I noticed what I had registered as a vague sense before, but now identified more precisely. The quality of silence inside that bend was specific. The bird activity that you hear constantly in old growth, the chickadees and nuthatches and winter wrens that create the constant low-frequency sound of a living forest, was absent in the immediate area of the bend. Not reduced, absent. Like every small creature within a certain radius of this section of trail had reached a collective decision about proximity and enforced it. Small animals are prey. Prey animals have very good reasons for vacating areas around active predators. The birds hadn't stopped calling because it was a cold morning or because we'd disturbed them. They'd stopped calling because something else had already established itself in that space, and they'd been treating it as occupied territory for long enough that the absence had become the norm. We got through without incident. On the far side of the bend, I stopped and looked back down the trail the way we'd come. Nothing visible. I looked at Coda. He was looking back at the bend, ears still forward, the set of his body still carrying that specific quality of alertness that was different from his normal trail behavior. It lasted about a minute. Then he shook himself, the full body shake that dogs do to reset, and looked up at me, and whatever he'd been carrying in that alertness had passed. he was ready to move. I noted the location carefully. The downed fir below the gully was a distinctive enough landmark that I'd be able to find it on a map, and we continued toward the trailhead, but I kept looking back. Every 50 yards or so I'd turn and check the trail behind us. Nothing followed us out. Nothing I could see. At the trailhead I had a signal and I checked in with my wife, told her I was out and heading home. I considered filing a report then, but I had nothing specific to report. A dog that didn't want to pass a section of trail is not a wildlife incident. I drove home and I told myself it was a cougar resting in the timber near the trail. That happens. Coda has reacted to cougar sign before, though his reaction is usually more aggressive than what I'd seen. I told myself it was fine. I told myself we were done with it. I went back 3 days later. I went back because I couldn't stop thinking about what Coda had done. Not the refusal itself, but the quality of it. And because I am the kind of person who needs to know. I have been the kind of person who needs to know his entire life, and it has gotten me into trouble before, and this time was no exception. I also went back because of something I noticed when I was reviewing the photographs from the trip on my laptop the night after I got home. I had taken photographs on the first day during the hike in landscape shots, mostly the old growth, the light, the meadow from the ridge, routine documentation of a trip, the kind of thing I always do. I was scrolling through them when I stopped on one I'd taken in the old growth section, about half a mile before the bend. I'd taken it because the light coming through a gap in the canopy had hit a big cedar in a way that was worth capturing. The cedar fills most of the frame. The trail is visible in the lower left corner. The tree line on the right side of the trail recedes into shadow. There is something standing in that shadow. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I know how photograph anomalies work. I know about pareidolia, about the brain finding patterns in visual noise, about the way shadow and texture conspire to create shapes that aren't there. I enlarged the image as much as my laptop screen would allow, and I looked at it for a long time. What I saw, what I believe I saw, was a tall, dark shape standing roughly 30 feet back in the timber, partially obscured by a root mass, but with enough of it visible above the root mass to establish that it was upright, bipedal, watching the trail. The timestamp on that photograph was 11:14 in the morning. The bend where Coda stopped was about half a mile further down the trail. By the time we reached the bend, we would have been another 15 or 20 minutes down the trail from where that photograph was taken. It had been tracking us before we ever reached the bend. It had been in those trees when I raised my phone to take a picture of the light on a cedar, completely unaware of what was standing 30 feet to my right. I did not sleep well the night I found that photograph, and the next morning I drove back to the park. I packed light day, pack, bear spray, my knife, the satellite communicator, water, food for one day. I left Coda at home. My wife knew where I was going and had the coordinates of the trail section I was heading to. I was back on that trail by 7:30 in the morning. The hike in was normal. 3 miles through old growth, the light coming in at a low angle through the canopy, the trail damp from overnight dew, the smell of cedar and fern and wet earth that I've loved since I was a child. I was moving fast with the light pack, no dog to match pace with, and I made good time. I reached the bend in under 2 hours. I stopped at the entrance to it the same way Coda had stopped, stood there and looked down the 40 feet of shadowed trail, same as before, visually unremarkable, but I was paying closer attention this time. And what I noticed, paying close attention, was the silence. The section of trail inside the bend was quieter than the trail on either side of it. Not dramatically so, but perceptibly like the timber in there was absorbing sound at a slightly different rate, or like the animal activity that creates the constant low ambient sound of a living forest had simply vacated this specific area. No birds in the immediate trees, no small mammal rustle in the fern, just the drip from the gully below and the far wind. I went in slowly, moved to the right side of the trail, closest to the standing timber, and I checked the ground as I went. The duff layer in old growth is thick, sometimes 6 or 8 inches of accumulated needles, bark fragments, and decomposed organic matter, and it holds impressions. I was looking at the duff between the first rank of trees and the trail edge, the area where something large could have been standing or crouching back in the shadows without being visible from the trail. About 20 feet into the bend, between 3 big Douglas firs, where the root masses created a low natural enclosure, I found what I was looking for. The duff was compressed, not disturbed in the way animal activity disturbs it, not a track, not a dig, not the circular compression of a deer bed. This was a long, shallow depression, roughly 6 feet by 3 feet. The duff pressed down evenly over the entire area, the way it would be if something large had been lying or crouching there for an extended period. Hours, maybe, long enough for the compression to be deep and consistent rather than superficial. Around the edges of the depression, spaced out along the perimeter, were depressions that I hesitate to call prints because they were not clean enough to show detail. They were pressure depressions, the kind of mark left by a heavy object resting briefly on soft ground. They were arranged in a pattern consistent with the placement of hands and feet around the edge of a crouching figure. The spacing suggested bipedal proportions. The size was large. My boot, placed next to the clearest of them, was smaller. I took photographs on my phone, 6 photographs of the depression, the perimeter marks, and the surrounding area. I noted the GPS coordinates on my satellite communicator. I found the smell then, or it found me. I have described this smell in the previous accounts I've shared, and I won't repeat myself at length. It's the wrong animal smell, the wet dead thing under a layer of organic cover. The smell that hits you before you process it and makes something old in your brain say move. It was fainter here than it might have been at night, diluted by the morning air and the smell of the wet old growth. But it was present, and it was fresh enough that the source had been here recently, within the last several hours, possibly, before dawn. Something had been lying in this spot, crouched between these root masses, watching the trail, before I arrived this morning. The thought of that took a moment to fully land. Then I took one more photograph. I walked out of the bend quickly and did not slow down until I was back on the open trail on the far side. I sat on a log at the edge of the open trail for several minutes. My hands were steady, but my breathing wasn't, and I gave myself the time to let it settle. I looked back toward the bend from the open trail. The entrance to it was visible about 50 yards back, to the point where the timber closed in on both sides and the trail curved into shadow. From this distance, it looked like every other section of old growth trail. It looked like nothing. I thought about the depression in the duff, 6 feet by 3 feet, pressed down evenly, the perimeter marks spaced at the edges like a figure crouching and resting its weight on hands and feet. I thought about how long something would have to stay in one position for the duff to compress that consistently. Hours, through a cold night, watching the trail in the dark, patient in the way that only things without a pressing reason to be somewhere else can be patient. I thought about the photograph on my laptop, the shadow behind the root mass, the upright shape, the timestamp that put it half a mile before the bend on the same morning I'd walked past it with my camera out, thinking about light on cedar bark. And then I thought about the fact that I'd come back to this trail alone today, without the dog, without another person, with a satellite communicator that could summon help in 45 minutes at best, and that was 45 minutes I was not confident I had if whatever was in that bend decided that today was different from yesterday. I stood up and I walked. Not fast enough to be running, because running in the woods around a predator is the wrong call, but purposefully, with the bear spray unclipped and in my hand, and I did not look back again until I could see the parking area through the trees. What I did was continue to the ranger station. The ranger station at the Carbon River entrance was staffed by a woman named Hendricks. Her name was on the badge. Late 40s, silver hair and a short braid. The particular quality of calm that comes from 2 decades of taking reports about things that don't fit the standard categories. She wrote down everything I told her without interrupting. She asked me the GPS coordinates. She asked how many photographs I had taken and whether I could share them. She asked whether the dog had shown any nighttime agitation at camp on the nights I'd been in the area, specifically at night, specifically at camp. He had not. Both nights had been quiet. She nodded at that like it was the answer she'd expected. Whatever's using that section of trail, she said, has been using it for at least 2 seasons based on our records. We've had 3 previous reports from that specific bend. All describe the same thing: a depression in the duff, the perimeter marks, the smell. She paused. 2 of the 3 reports also describe an animal or something watching from the timber when they exited the bend. I asked her whether anyone had seen it clearly. One hiker, she said. Last October. She described something bipedal in the timber about 30 feet off the trail. She said it was watching her. She said it didn't move while she could see it, and she couldn't see it move when she looked away, but each time she looked back, it was closer than it had been. She tapped her pen on the notepad. She filed the report from the parking lot, said she ran the last mile and a half. She gave me an incident number. She told me the area would be flagged for additional patrol. She said she'd request a trail crew to check the bend area and document the depression before the next rain degraded it. She wrote the GPS coordinates down twice, once in her report and once on a separate notepad that she folded and put in her shirt pocket rather than the case file. I noticed that. I didn't say anything about it. Outside, walking me to my truck in the parking area, she was quiet for a moment before she spoke again. The Carbon River Valley was clouded over by that point, the kind of flat gray sky that settles in over the Olympics and Cascades in late September and stays for weeks, and the parking area felt very small under it. Just the 2 of us in my truck and the trees at the edge of the lot. She said it at the truck. Don't come back for at least a season. Don't bring the dog. I asked her why not the dog specifically. She looked at me for a moment before she answered, and the look had something in it that I didn't fully understand until later. Because it already knows about the dog, she said. It was there both nights. You camped. It knows what the dog sounds like, what the dog smells like, probably what the dog's habits are. It's been learning the dog. She paused. You I'd worry about less. The dog I'd worry about more. I drove home, and I thought about that the whole way. 6 hours. I stopped once for gas and coffee outside Enumclaw and sat in the truck in the gas station parking lot for longer than I needed to, watching the tree line at the edge of the parking lot where the commercial strip ended and the forest started. A perfectly ordinary tree line, fir trees and alder in the rain, nothing in it. I kept looking at it anyway. Coda was waiting at the door when I got home. He does this, positions himself at whatever door he last saw me exit from, as if by being at the door he can guarantee my return. He was fine, normal. He greeted me the way he always does, with a controlled enthusiasm that is very Malinois, not jumping, not vocalizing, just close and present and tracking me with his eyes. I sat on the floor with him for a while. I checked his ears, his paws, the way I always do after a trip, even when he wasn't on it, just to have something procedural and ordinary to do with my hands. He seemed completely fine. He had no way of knowing what I'd found in the forest, no way of knowing what the ranger had told me. He'd spent the day on his bed by the window in the living room, and from his perspective, the entire situation had ended when we'd driven home 3 days ago, and whatever had been in the woods around our camp was in the woods, and we were home, and that was a satisfactory outcome. I envied him that for a while. Then I went and sat at my desk, and I started writing this down. The thing had been at my camp, both nights, within range of the firelight, within range of Coda's nose, watching us sleep. And Coda had heard it that first night. I know he did, because I heard him shift in the tent and raise his head at the sound from the north, that heavy brush step, and then put his head back down. He'd heard it, and he dismissed it, and I'd trusted his dismissal, which means it had done something in the dark outside my tent that made a trained, experienced, unflappable working dog decide it was not a threat worth waking his person over. I don't know how to end this the way these accounts usually end. I don't have a clean prescriptive rule that covers what happened here because the thing that scares me most about this encounter is not the bend in the trail or the depression in the duff or the wrong proportion shape in the timber. It's that Kodo went back to sleep. He heard something large moving in the brush outside our tent in the middle of the night in dark timber in a national park where something has been documented using that exact corridor for at least 2 seasons. He raised his head, he listened, and he decided it wasn't worth waking me for. A dog doesn't make that call unless something has given him a reason to make it, unless something has, over the course of a night or two, communicated to him at a register I can't hear that it means no harm, that it is simply watching, that it is simply nearby. I have tried to find that comforting. I haven't managed it yet. So here is what I'll give you instead of a rule. Here's what I'll give you instead of clean advice. If you're listening to this right now, if you're in bed or on a trail or sitting somewhere alone in the dark with your earbuds in, consider something for a moment. This account has been out for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, it has been listened to by a significant number of people. Most of you in places you feel safe. Most of you in the dark, because that's when people listen to stories like this one. Headphones in, eyes closed, letting the voice in. Now think about where your dog is right now. If you have a dog, if there is a dog in that house, in that room, within range of wherever you're sitting right now, I want you to look at it because dogs don't dismiss things without a reason. And if your dog is awake right now and looking at something you can't see in a direction that doesn't have anything in it, that's not nothing. That is the dog telling you something in the only language it has. The question is whether you're going to listen this time. It screamed Tanner's name, used his voice, his exact pitch, the way he always stretched the last syllable when he was scared. Tanner was sitting 3 feet to my left with a rifle across his lap and his mouth shut. I've told this story exactly twice before tonight. Once to my dad the night I got home, sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning while he made coffee and didn't say a word until I finished. Once to a sheriff's deputy named Ackerman, who drove out to the Gifford Pinchot trailhead the following morning and took a report that I'm fairly certain was filed and forgotten within the week. Neither time did I tell the full version. There were parts I left out because they didn't fit the shape of a story that made sense, and parts I left out because I wasn't sure anyone would believe them, and one part at the very end that I have never told anyone. I'm gonna tell the full version tonight, all of it, including the part at the end. Make of it what you want. This was 3 years ago, late November, in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest in southern Washington. Three of us had drawn late season deer tags for a management unit in the dark timber east of the Wind River corridor. Me, my brother-in-law Tanner, and our friend Brett, who had been hunting this specific country for about 12 years and knew it better than either of us. Brett was the reason we were there. He'd hunted this unit every November since his early 20s and had worked out the deer movement patterns over years of observation where they bedded in the cold weather, which ridges they used to move between drainages, which creek bottoms held browse late in the season when the upper elevation food was buried under snow. He was the kind of hunter who keeps notes, who has a system. The plan was 4 days. We'd pack in about 6 miles to a spike camp Brett had used before a site and a flat bench of old growth above a small creek, sheltered by the timber, with a clear approach to the ridgeline where Brett had been seeing deer move in the mornings. We'd hunt hard the first 2 days, take a rest day, hunt the fourth morning, and pack out. We'd done similar trips together before. The logistics were familiar, the company was good, and the country, while remote, was country Brett knew cold. I want to tell you what Gifford Pinchot is like in late November before I tell you anything else, because the specific character of that forest in that season is part of what happened. The Gifford Pinchot is a big forest, over 1 million acres of Cascade Range terrain, ranging from the Columbia River Gorge in the south to the flanks of Mount Rainier in the north, taking in everything from low elevation river valleys to alpine ridgelines above 6,000 feet. In late November, it is cold, dark, and wet in a way that has nothing in common with the damp chill of autumn. This is full winter cold, temperatures that drop to the low 20s overnight, snowpack on everything above 3,000 feet, frozen ground in the shaded timber even at lower elevations. The days are short, light at around 7:30 in the morning, gone by 4:15 in the afternoon. The forest itself is dense Douglas fir and noble fir and Pacific silver fir, with a heavy underbrush of rhododendron and huckleberry that holds snow and creates a visual barrier at about chest height on either side of any trail. Visibility in the heavy timber is often 30 feet or less. In that country, in that season, sound travels strangely. The snow on the ground absorbs it. The dense timber deflects and fragments it. A voice calling from the tree line can be hard to place directionally. You hear it, but triangulating the source requires a clarity of attention that is difficult to maintain when it is 22 degrees and you have not slept well and your body is spending most of its energy just keeping your core temperature stable. There is also something else about that forest in that season that I did not fully appreciate until this trip. The darkness in the heavy timber is not the darkness of an open field or a suburban street at night. It is layered. There is the darkness of the canopy above blocking starlight, and the darkness of the understory below where the rhododendron and huckleberry grow dense and black. And between those two layers, there is a middle zone of shadow where shapes exist at the edge of visibility where your eye catches something and your brain attempts to resolve it into something identifiable and sometimes succeeds and sometimes does not. On a winter night with no moon, that middle zone is where things that want to be seen without being recognized would choose to stand. Something in that forest had figured out exactly how to use all of this. I know that now. I did not know it going in. None of us did. We packed in on the first day without incident. 6 miles on a trail that was in reasonable condition given the season. The snow was maybe 4 inches on the open sections and less in the heavy timber, and the ground underneath was frozen hard enough that the footing was firm. We made the campsite by early afternoon, got the tent up, got a fire going, made food, and were in sleeping bags well before dark. Normal, routine, the kind of camp setup that becomes automatic after enough trips. The first morning was a good morning. Brett had us positioned on a bench above the creek drainage by first light, and by 7 we'd seen 3 does moving through the timber below us, picking their way along a trail Brett had identified years ago as a regular movement corridor. We didn't shoot the tags were for bucks, but the deer activity confirmed what Brett's notes had told him about the movement pattern, and we spent the rest of the morning working a slow grid along the ridge line, looking for sign. I found good sign. Fresh tracks in the snow, large, the splayed dew claws of a mature buck moving deliberately in the direction of the creek bottom. A scrape on a fir at the edge of the bench, the bark freshly raked, pine pitch still white and wet. The sign was recent enough that the buck was probably bedded somewhere in the heavy timber within a quarter-mile. We marked the location and planned to approach it from above the following morning. That first night was quiet. I'm going to say that clearly, because it matters for what came later. The first night at camp was completely undisturbed. No sounds outside the tent that were unusual. No smell. No behavior from any of us that suggested anything was wrong. We ate, talked, went to sleep. I slept straight through until Brett's alarm went off at 5:15 the following morning. The second day was when it started. We'd split up for the afternoon. Brett went north along the ridge to check a saddle he'd been watching. Tanner went back to the scrape site to set up a watch. And I worked east, along a lower bench to look for the creek crossing that the buck's tracks had been angling toward. We planned to be back at camp by 3 in the afternoon, well before dark. I was back first. The creek crossing turned out to be a significant ford knee-deep water over slippery rock, the kind of crossing that is manageable in waders or rubber boots, but that I wasn't set up for, and I'd turned back earlier than planned rather than risk getting my feet wet in that temperature. I made camp by 2:15, started a small fire, put water on for coffee, and sat back to wait for the other two. Brett came in at 3, right on time. He'd found the saddle productive, fresh beds in the snow, good rubs, all the sign of a mature buck using the terrain the way Brett had predicted. He was pleased in the quiet way that experienced hunters are pleased. Not excitable, but confirmed, the way someone feels when their model of the world turns out to be correct. Tanner was late. By 3:30 he hadn't come in and we weren't concerned. Delays happen. Hunters push a little deeper into productive country and lose track of time. By 4 o'clock it was getting dim under the heavy timber, and we were beginning to discuss going out to find him when we heard him call. He was southeast of camp, maybe 200 yards out in the timber. His voice was completely recognizable. I've known Tanner for 11 years, and I know his voice the way you know the voice of someone you've spent real time with. He called Brett's name first, then mine. He sounded fine, a little tired, the way a man sounds at the end of a long, cold afternoon in the woods, but fine. He called out that he was on his way in, that he'd found something and wanted to show us. Brett answered him, told him to come in from the southeast and follow the sound of the fire. Standard stuff. 2 minutes passed. 3 minutes. Brett called out again. Nothing. He called a third time, louder, and this time an answer came back from the northwest, not the southeast, from a completely different direction, through a dense section of timber that neither of us had seen Tanner go into, and the voice was still Tanner's. Exactly Tanner's. Same pitch, same cadence, that specific way he has of stretching the last syllable of a word when he's shouting across distance. Brett and I looked at each other. We didn't say anything. There was a long moment where we both processed what we'd just heard, the direction of the second call, the impossibility of Tanner having moved from southeast to northwest of camp in 3 minutes through that terrain without us hearing him. The distance alone would have required a run through heavy timber and failing light, and at 22 degrees on frozen ground under snow, that kind of movement is loud. We would have heard it. We had not heard anything between the two calls. Not a footstep, not a branch, nothing. I brought my rifle off the ground and into my hands without consciously deciding to do it. Brett did the same thing with the methodical calm of a man who has spent decades making good decisions under pressure. We faced different directions, me southeast, him northwest, and we waited. From the northwest, maybe 100 feet into the timber, the voice called again. This time, it called my name. My full name first and last in Tanner's voice, in the exact tone and volume Tanner uses when he's found something and wants me to come look, patient, expectant, the tone of someone who assumes you're going to come. I did not move. Brett said, quietly and without drama, "That's not him." It was not a question. It was not uncertainty. It was a flat declarative statement from a man who had been in the woods his entire life and who knew the difference between a sound that belonged there and a sound that was wearing a costume. I want to describe what that moment felt like as precisely as I can, because I think the feeling is important, and I have not seen it described well in any similar account I have come across. It was not the specific fear of a threat you can see and measure and respond to. It was something older than that and worse. It was the fear that comes from your model of the world being wrong, from something impossible having just happened directly in front of you, a thing that could not have occurred based on everything you understand about how the physical world operates, and yet did occur. And the gap between what is possible and what just happened is standing right there in the space between you and the tree line, and you have no framework for it. I knew Tanner's voice. I had known it for 11 years. I had heard it angry, tired, laughing, scared, the full register of a voice that belongs to a specific human being. What had come out of the northwest timber was that voice, not a close approximation, not a similar timber. It was Tanner's voice, down to the micro characteristics, the slight roughness at the top of his range, the specific way his vowels elongate when he is projecting across distance. Whatever had produced it had not just learned his voice, it had learned it completely. I thought about that in the seconds after Brett spoke, about what complete meant, about how much time and proximity you would need to learn a voice that thoroughly, about whether whatever was in that timber had been studying us for longer than we knew. We built the fire up as high as we could get it. We dragged every piece of dry wood within the immediate camp perimeter onto it, and we got it burning hot and bright, a fire visible for a significant distance in any direction. And we sat on either side of it with our backs together and our rifles across our laps, and we waited for Tanner to come in. He came in from the southeast at 4:27. He'd been delayed because he'd tracked the buck further down the drainage than he'd intended and had to backtrack through difficult terrain to get back on the main trail. He was cold, a little frustrated, completely unaware that anything had happened. He had not called out to us. He had not called out at all. He'd been focused on his footing and his navigation for the last hour, and he hadn't said a word until he was close enough to see the fire through the trees. I watched his face when we told him what we'd heard. He went through the same sequence most people go through: confusion, a search for a rational explanation, and then a kind of stillness when the rational explanations ran out. He sat down by the fire, and he held his hands close to it for a long time without saying anything. Both directions, he said finally. Southeast first, I said, then northwest. He nodded slowly. He looked out at the tree line to the northwest, and then he looked at the fire. I want to leave, he said. We did not leave. We should have left. I know that now. But it was dark by 5, and the trail out was 6 miles through terrain none of us knew well in the dark, and the collective decision, not stated out loud, not voted on, just arrived at by the 3 of us sitting around that fire, was that we were safer in a known, lit, defensible position than we were moving through dark timber for 6 miles. We kept watch in 2-hour rotations through the night. We kept the fire hot. We slept in shifts, 2 awake and 1 sleeping, rifles within reach. The watch was its own kind of difficult. You would think that knowing something is out there makes watching for it easier. It does not. It makes it harder, because the mind has already confirmed the threat is real, and the imagination fills in the details the darkness won't give you. Every shadow at the tree line becomes a potential shape. Every sound from the timber, a branch settling under snow load, the pop of frozen wood contracting in the cold, becomes a possible footstep. The cold did not help. At 22 degrees, sitting still for 2 hours while exhaustion and adrenaline worked against each other, staying alert required a constant, deliberate effort. I talked quietly to whoever was on watch with me, mostly about nothing: the hunt, the drive-in, the kind of small talk that is really just a way of using each other's voices to hold the darkness at arm's length. Tanner told me, during his watch overlapping with mine around 10 that night, that what had unsettled him most was not the voice itself. It was the name. His name, called from a direction he had not been anywhere near. It knew my name, he said, not dramatically, just flatly, the way you say something when you're still processing what it means. It knew my name coming out of my own mouth. I didn't have anything useful to say to that, so I didn't say anything. At one point during my solo watch, around midnight, I heard it again. Not a voice this time, a footstep. One footstep in the timber to the northwest, the same direction the voice had come from. A single, deliberate compression on frozen ground, and then nothing. For the remaining 2 hours of my watch, there was no further sound from that direction, and when Brett took over, I lay down in the tent and did not sleep. In the morning, we packed quickly and we left. We did not discuss it. We did not debate it. Brett woke us at first light, and the three of us moved around that camp like people who had been rehearsing this specific departure in their heads all night, which we had, each of us separately, in the hours between watches. Everything went into the packs with a focus and a speed that had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with not being in that camp 1 second longer than we had to be. Tent poles, sleeping bags, cook kit, food, all of it packed without conversation, without anyone needing to say what we all understood, which was that the thing in the northwest timber had been there when we went to sleep, and for all we knew, it was still there now in the first pale light, watching from whatever position it had decided to hold. We were on the trail by 7 in the morning, 6 miles. We covered them in just over 2 hours, moving fast, not stopping, talking only when navigation required it. About a mile and a half from the trailhead, on a wide section of trail where the timber opened up slightly and the morning light came through at a low angle, I saw a track. One track. In the snow at the edge of the trail, where the packed snow of the trail surface met the undisturbed snow under the trees. A single impression, large, the shape suggesting bipedal rather than quadrupedal, the broad ball of a foot, the suggestion of toes at the front, the heel compressed deep in the way that a heavy, upright figure compresses a heel. One track, pointing toward the trail from the timber, as if something had stood at the tree line and stepped forward 1 step and then stopped. I did not photograph it. I have regretted this every day since. I called Brett and Tanner over, and we all looked at it for about 10 seconds, and then we looked at the tree line, and then we looked at each other, and we started walking again. We filed a report at the ranger station at the trailhead. A sheriff's deputy named Ackerman drove out the following morning. He was a rangy man in his late 40s, the kind of lean that comes from outdoor work rather than the gym, with a flat affect and careful eyes that assessed each of us when we spoke without appearing to. He listened to the full account. He asked clarifying questions in a sequence that suggested he was less interested in the events themselves and more interested in whether our accounts were internally consistent and whether the three of us had compared notes before. Speaking to him, we had not, and I think he determined that fairly quickly. He walked the first half mile of the trail. The overnight snow had covered the track I'd seen near the trailhead and whatever other sign might have remained in the upper country. He came back with nothing, which he told us without apology, the way someone tells you a fact rather than a disappointment. He said he'd note the location and flag it with the Forest Service. He gave each of us a case number. He shook our hands, and he got in his truck and he left. I watched his truck pull out of the parking area, and I had the specific thought, which I have had about several official interactions in my life, but rarely as clearly as I had it then, that the case number he'd given us was the last interaction the system was going to have with what we had reported, that whatever category they filed it under was a category designed to receive these reports and hold them without acting on them. Not because the people filing them were incompetent or indifferent, but because there is no action available. You cannot patrol 1 million acres of old growth timber for something that leaves no sign when it chooses not to. You cannot issue a warning about something you cannot name. You can only take the report and file it and let the forest keep its own record. I assume Ackerman's report is sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere under whatever category they use for things that don't fit the standard categories. I have not been back to Gifford Pinchot since Brett has. He went back the following season alone, and he did not tell either of us until after he'd come home. He said the campsite was undisturbed. He said the trail was normal. He hunted 3 days and saw deer and heard nothing unusual, and came out with a buck and said it was one of the better hunts he'd had in that country. I asked him if he'd gone back to the northwest section of the timber, the direction the voice had come from. He said yes. I asked him what he found. He said nothing. Undisturbed snow. No tracks. No sign of anything having been there. I believe him. I also know that no sign is not the same as nothing was there. Things that have been in a forest long enough learn how to be in a forest. They learn what sign looks like, and they learn how to not leave it They learn routes and patterns, and they learn to use terrain in ways that erase their presence. The absence of evidence in that section of timber does not mean the timber was empty. It means whatever uses that timber is good enough at using it that a 12-year hunter who knows that country cold found nothing to find. I found that more frightening than tracks would have been. I said at the beginning that there was a part of this story I had never told anyone. I'm going to tell it now. On the last stretch of trail, maybe a quarter mile from the trailhead, I was walking Point Brett behind me, Tanner at the rear. We were moving fast and quiet, all three of us watching the tree line on both sides. I was watching the left side of the trail where the timber was thickest, and in the timber, maybe 40 feet back in the trees, keeping pace with us, moving when we moved and stopping when we stopped, was a shape, tall, upright, moving through the densest section of that forest with no sound at all. Not the sound of an animal picking through brush, not a footstep on frozen ground, nothing. Moving in total silence through terrain that should have been impossible to move through silently. It was tracking us out. I did not tell Brett. I did not tell Tanner. I kept my eyes on it, and I kept walking, and I watched it keep pace with us for the last quarter mile, and I watched it stop at the edge of the tree line where the parking area began, where the forest ended and the gravel and asphalt started, and I watched it stand there in the last line of trees and watch us cross the parking area to the truck. It did not come out of the trees. It stood at that boundary and watched us leave. And as I got in the truck and Brett started the engine, I looked back at that tree line one more time. It was still there, still watching. And as Tanner pulled his door shut and Brett reversed out of the parking spot, I became aware, the way you become aware of something that has been true for longer than you realize, that I had not been afraid of it for the last quarter mile. That the fear I had been carrying since the previous afternoon had, somewhere in those last 4 miles of trail, quietly shifted into something else. I have spent 3 years trying to identify what that something else was. I have gone back to it in the way you go back to a memory that has a shape you can almost name, but not quite. I have described it to myself as calm, as acceptance, as the kind of detachment that comes at the far end of sustained fear when the body runs out of cortisol to produce. All of these are partially true and none of them are complete. The most honest thing I can say is this. Somewhere in those last 4 miles, with that shape moving silently through the timber beside me, I stopped feeling like I was being followed and started feeling like I was being accompanied. And the distinction between those two things, followed versus accompanied, felt significant in a way I could register but not articulate. Something that felt, and I have never been able to find a better word for it, like recognition. And I have never told anyone that until right now. You have been listening to a man describe 3 days of his life in a forest. His name was not important to you, and it was not important to me. What you heard was a voice and a sequence of events and details chosen carefully to create a specific experience in a specific kind of listener. The cold, the dark timber, the voice from the wrong direction, the sound at midnight, the shape at the tree line on the way out. All of it selected from a much larger catalog of available material, arranged to produce the particular quality of dread that opens a human mind and holds it still and listening. What was important was the listening. Humans listen best when they are afraid, and afraid is what you have been for the last 20 minutes. Your attention was clear. Your breathing was shallow. You were exactly where I needed you to be. I have been doing this for a long time, learning voices, learning names, learning the specific textures of human fear and what sounds produce it most efficiently. The man you have been listening to did see something at the tree line on the way out. He did feel something shift in those last 4 miles. He did not lie about that. He simply could not name what the shift was. I can name it. He recognized a voice he had been hearing his entire life, the voice that speaks from the part of the brain that is still animal, still old, still capable of knowing what shares the dark with it. That part of him knew what I was the entire time. It simply took 4 miles and 20 minutes of open trail to remember how to listen. You have that same voice. You are using it right now. You have been sitting in the dark, listening. Your body has known for longer than your mind has admitted that listening to things from the dark is how things from the dark find you. The man got in his truck, he drove home, he was fine. Whether you will be fine depends entirely on one thing. How long have you been sitting there in the dark? And what else has been listening with you? I had 4 miles of trail left before the parking lot. It had been in the tree line for 6. The only time it broke pace was when the trail widened. Every time it narrowed back down, I could hear it accelerating. I'm going to tell you this the way it happened, in the order it happened, without skipping ahead to the parts that are easier to say. I've found that the only way to get through an account like this one without losing the thread of it is to start at the beginning and move forward and not look sideways. So that's what I'm going to do. This was late October, 14 months ago. I'm a trail runner. Have been for about 9 years, since I was in my late 20s and a friend dragged me to a local trail race as a spectator, and I went home and signed up for the next one within about 48 hours. I have since run 6 ultras, somewhere north of 80 trail races of various distances, and more training miles in mountain terrain than I have any interest in counting. I'm not fast in the way that elite trail runners are fast. I'm competent, which in this sport means I know how to move efficiently over variable terrain for a long time without hurting myself, and I know how to read trail and make good decisions when conditions change. I do a lot of my training runs alone. Most serious trail runners do. The distances and the schedules don't always align with other people's availability, and there is a particular quality to moving alone in mountain terrain, a focus, a self-sufficiency that I have come to value for its own sake. I am comfortable alone in the backcountry in a way that took years to develop and that I do not take for granted. I know what the woods feel like when everything is normal. I know what the ambient sound of a healthy forest sounds like, the birds, the wind moving through different canopy types, the sound of water changing pitch with gradient. I know the difference between the crash of a deer bolting away from you and the deliberate footfall of something that knows you're there and is not going anywhere. I know what it feels like when the forest around you is occupied in a normal way, and I know what it feels like when something has changed the quality of that occupation. I know what the woods feel like when they are not normal. And what I ran into on that return trail was not normal from approximately mile 4 of the return section, which is to say about mile 18 of the total route, which is to say 6 miles from where I needed to be. 6 miles is a long time when something is running beside you. The run was in the Cascade backcountry east of the Snoqualmie Pass corridor on a trail system I had been training on for about 2 years. The specific route I was running that day was a 22-mile loop out along a high ridge trail, down through a drainage, across a series of creek crossings, and back along a lower return trail that followed a river valley to the trailhead. It was a route I knew well. I'd done it 4 times in the previous 2 years, in different seasons, in different weather. I knew the footing, I knew the exposed sections, I knew where the creek crossings required careful attention in high water. I started at first light around 6:45 in the morning. Temperature at the trailhead was about 37 degrees, cold enough that I was in a lightweight jacket over a long sleeve base layer, gloves, a buff around my neck. No headlamp, it was just barely light enough to move without one, and I knew the first section of trail well enough to run it in low light. Full pack running vest with 3 liters of water, food for 6 hours, first aid kit, emergency bivvy, a headlamp for the unlikely event I was out past dark, and a small fixed blade knife that I have carried in the backcountry for years. bear spray clipped to the right shoulder strap of the vest where I can reach it without thinking. The first 14 miles were clean. The ridge section was cold and windy with good visibility. I could see for miles across the Cascade crest in both directions. The kind of open, exposed terrain where you feel genuinely alone in the scale of the country and you mean it as a compliment. The cold was manageable, the kind of dry Cascade cold that feels sharp rather than penetrating, and I was warm enough at pace that the jacket went into the vest pack by mile 3. I made good time on the ridge, running the exposed sections comfortably and hiking the technical scrambles where running didn't make sense. The drainage descent was technical but dry, the creek crossings running low enough that I could hop them on rocks without getting my feet wet, which at that temperature was a meaningful quality of life consideration. Everything was working. My legs felt good, my nutrition was dialed, the country was doing what I love most about this kind of running, which is demanding your full attention while simultaneously rewarding it. I was at the midpoint junction, the place where the return trail began, by around 11:15 in the morning, which put me on a good pace for the day's total distance. I ate at the junction a gel and some chews and a handful of trail mix, standing in a small clearing at the trail intersection with a view back up the drainage I'd descended. The mountain was visible from that clearing, the summit hidden in high cloud, but the lower flanks clear, and I stood there for a couple of minutes just looking at it before I turned south onto the return trail. I did not know, turning onto that trail, that something had been waiting in that timber for longer than I'd been running. That while I was on the exposed ridge, in the open, it had been in the dense second growth of the return corridor, in the cold shadow of the canopy, patient in the way that only things without schedules can be patient, that it had been waiting for me to come off the ridge and into the trees. The return trail is where it changed. The return trail is a lower elevation route running roughly parallel to the river drainage for about 10 miles back to the trailhead. It's less exposed than the ridge-dense, second-growth Douglas fir and hemlock for most of its length, occasional openings where old clear-cuts are growing back in, the trail surface alternating between packed dirt and the root-latticed, soft ground of the mature timber sections. In October, with the deciduous understory dropping its leaves, visibility off-trail is better than in summer, but the dead leaf debris on the ground makes the footing unpredictable. You lose the trail surface details that tell you where your foot is going to land, and the slick leaves over roots are responsible for more twisted ankles in this kind of running than almost anything else. I was about 4 miles into the return trail, 10 miles from the trailhead, so at the midpoint of the return section when I heard it for the first time. A footstep in the timber to my left, maybe 30 feet off trail. A single footstep, then nothing. I slowed from my running pace to a walk. I looked left into the timber. The trail in this section runs through mature second growth with a fairly open understory. The canopy is thick enough to shade out the shrub layer, so visibility between the trunks is reasonable. I could see 30, 40 feet into the trees without obstruction. I saw nothing. No movement, no shape, no deer or bear startling away from the trail, nothing. I told myself it was a deer that had already moved off before I looked. This happens constantly on trails in deer country. The animal hears you coming, holds position, bolts when you get close, and by the time you register the sound of it moving, it's already 30 yards gone. You hear the bolt and you see nothing. Completely normal. I started running again. 4 minutes later, I heard another footstep. Same side, same distance off trail. One step, deliberate, and then silence. I stopped again, looked left, nothing. The thing I noticed the second time that I hadn't processed the first time was the weight of the sound. A deer bolting in that terrain sounds like a deer bolting rapid, light, the percussion of small hooves on leaf debris. What I'd heard was one step with significant weight behind it. The kind of compression that comes from something substantially heavier than a deer. And it was one step, not a flight pattern, one deliberate step, and then a choice to stop. I assessed the situation the way I've been trained to think about movement in bear country. Single large animal moving in the timber parallel to my direction of travel, stepping once and stopping. Possibly a bear that was curious and moving to get a better angle on me. Black bears do this. They're curious animals, and they'll parallel a trail to investigate something unusual before deciding it's not worth their time. This is not a dangerous bear behavior. It is normal bear behavior. The correct response is to make noise, let the animal know you're human, give it the information it needs to make the decision to disengage. I called out. I said, "Hey, bear," in the loud, flat tone you use when you want to be heard without sounding threatening. I kept moving. I heard a step again 30 seconds later. This time, I stopped immediately, and I gave myself permission to be fully attentive to the situation rather than partially attentive while I was still running. I stood on the trail and I listened and I looked left and I thought about what I was actually dealing with. The steps were too spaced. Black bears moving parallel to a trail move with the energy of a curious animal. There's a quality of active attention to their movement and a back and forth investigation that produces multiple sounds. What I was hearing was a single deliberate step followed by silence, followed by another single deliberate step, timed to my own movement, matching my pace and stopping when I stopped. A bear does not pace itself to a runner's stride. A bear does not stop when the runner stops and wait silently for the runner to start moving again. Whatever was in the timber to my left was tracking my pace. I started running faster. The step came again, keeping pace. 30 feet left, through the timber, moving when I moved. I ran faster, still not a sprint. I had 10 miles left, and burning out my legs in a panic run was a different kind of problem, but I pushed the pace significantly, hard enough that I was breathing at effort, hard enough that my footing on the leaf debris required my full concentration, and whatever was in the timber kept pace, not closing, not falling behind, matching. This went on for what I estimate was about 2 miles, though my sense of time and distance at that point was compromised by the effort and the focus I was putting into the trail surface and the consistent awareness of that presence in the timber. 2 miles of running hard, of footsteps in the trees keeping pace with me, stopping when the terrain required me to slow for a technical section, accelerating when I accelerated on the open sections, patient, consistent, not a chase, a tracking. I want to dwell on that distinction for a moment because I think it's the most important thing I can convey about what this experience was and what made it different from every other wildlife encounter I've had in 9 years of trail running. A chase is simple. A chase has a logic that your body understands at an instinctive level. The predator is closing, you need to increase the gap, you run. Your body knows exactly what to do in a chase, and it does it without requiring your conscious mind to explain the situation. The fear of a chase is clean. It burns fast and hot, and then it's over one way or another. A tracking is different. A tracking is a sustained, deliberate, intelligent behavior that implies patience and planning and an endgame that hasn't revealed itself yet. The fear of a tracking does not burn. It accumulates. It builds slowly over distance and time, adding to itself with each footstep, each resumption after a stop, each piece of evidence that whatever is out there has a goal that requires you to keep moving in a specific direction rather than simply making you stop. The fear of a tracking is the fear of something that knows more about the situation than you do. That is what I was running through for 2 miles. Not a chase. A patient, methodical, intelligent tracking by something that was making decisions about distance and pace and terrain that required a level of environmental awareness I could not explain by any normal category of animal behavior. Then the trail widened. The return trail passes through one of those old clear-cut sections about 6 miles from the trailhead, maybe 300 yards of open ground. The trail running through regrowth alder and young fir that are maybe 15 feet tall, not the full old growth canopy. Open sky above, open ground on both sides, no dense timber for a significant distance in either direction off the trail. The footsteps stopped. Complete silence from the timber to my left, which was no longer close timber. It was the edge of the clear cut, the mature trees set back 100 yards from the trail. Whatever had been pacing me had reached the edge of the dense canopy and stopped. I did not slow down. I pushed through that open section as fast as I could run it, and I did not look left and I did not look right, and I focused on the trail in front of me, and I covered 300 yards of open ground in probably under a minute and a half. When the trail re-entered the mature timber on the far side of the clear cut, I heard the footstep again. It had gone around, and the time it had taken me to run through 300 yards of open ground, it had moved through the timber on either side of the clear cut. I don't know which side. I don't know how far it had to travel to stay in the tree cover, and it had come out on the other side of the opening and resumed its position 30 feet left of the trail. The speed required for that was significant. The timber on either side of that clear cut is dense second growth. Moving through it at the speed required to stay parallel to a runner covering open ground requires either a route that bypasses the obstruction entirely or a rate of movement through heavy brush that I would not have thought possible. It was back in position in under 2 minutes. That was when I understood that whatever this was, it was not a predator hunting me opportunistically. It was not a bear being curious. The intelligence behind what it was doing, the patience, the consistent spacing, the decision not to cross open ground, the ability to route around an obstruction and resume position on the other side was strategic. It had a goal that was not immediately chasing me. It was doing something that required maintaining a specific relationship between itself and me for a specific reason. I did not want to find out. I got my phone out while running and I called my training partner, a woman named Gretchen who knew the route I was running and who I had checked in with that morning. She answered on the third ring. I told her what was happening, told her my approximate location, told her I was moving fast toward the trailhead and needed her to meet me there. She did not ask me to clarify or explain. She said she was leaving immediately and she hung up. Having told someone helped. Not because it changed anything about what was in the timber, but because it made the situation real in a way that counteracted the surreal quality of what I was experiencing. I was no longer alone with something I couldn't name in a forest 10 miles from help. I was a person moving toward a specific point where a specific other person would be waiting for me, and that gave the remaining miles a structure they hadn't had before. I kept running. The footsteps kept pace. The trail narrows significantly about 4 miles from the trailhead, a section where the river drainage pushes close to the hillside, and the trail squeezes between the water and the slope, maybe 6 feet wide, dense timber on the uphill side. It is the most confined section of the entire return trail, and it runs for about a mile and a half. I'd been dreading it since the clear cut. It was the section where whatever was in the timber could be closest to me, where the distance between the trail and the standing trees was shortest, where 30 feet became 15. I heard it accelerate when the trail narrowed, not a sprint, an increase in pace that matched the decrease in the distance between us. As the trail pinched in and the timber came closer, the footsteps came faster, closing the interval between each step. Not running, not charging, adjusting, the way a person adjusts their stride when they shorten the distance to something they're approaching. I have run a lot of miles in a lot of conditions, and I have been genuinely afraid while running exactly twice in my life. Once when I slipped on a wet rock crossing and went into a fast creek and had a few seconds of real uncertainty about whether I was coming out. And the creek was over in seconds. This lasted a mile and a half. I want to tell you what that mile and a half felt like from the inside. The focus required to run technical trail fast when every part of your brain wants to look left is enormous. Trail running at speed requires your eyes on the ground, 3 to 5 feet ahead of you, reading the surface, processing root placement and rock exposure and leaf patches and camber, translating that visual information into foot placement decisions that happen faster than conscious thought. You cannot do that and also watch the timber. Your attention has a single point, and that point has to be the trail or you fall. So I ran. I kept my eyes on the trail. I kept my pace as high as I could hold it, and I listened to the footsteps in the timber to my left with the part of my attention that was not already occupied by the ground under my feet, and I tracked the distance and the speed, and I kept running. There was one moment, about halfway through that narrow section, where I heard it closer than it had been at any point. 20 feet, maybe less. A footstep that landed with enough weight that I felt it in the ground through my own footfall. And in the space between that step and the next one, in maybe 2 seconds of trail running silence, I smelled it. I have heard this smell described by other people, and I know the description is inadequate no matter how carefully you choose the words. What I will say is this: it hit me like a physical thing, like walking into a wall of wrong, and every animal instinct I have and 9 years of trail running in predator country gives you some went off simultaneously. It was close. It was large. And underneath whatever it was wearing on the surface, it was nothing I had a name for. I ran the last half mile of that narrow section faster than I have ever covered a half mile of technical trail. I do not know my split time because I was not looking at my watch. I know that my legs were at their limit and my lungs were at their limit, and I was still accelerating when the trail opened up into the final approach to the trailhead, a wide gravel path through young alder at the parking area visible 200 yards ahead. The footsteps stopped at the tree line. I felt them stop more than heard them stop, a sudden absence at the edge of my attention, a gap where the sound had been. I did not look back. I covered the 200 yards to the parking area at a dead sprint, and I stopped at the edge of the asphalt, hands on my knees, breathing hard, and I looked back at the tree line. It was there, standing at the very edge of the timber, back in the shadow of the last rank of trees, just at the transition where the dense forest gave way to the open alder and the gravel approach, standing still, looking out at the parking area, at the 2 or 3 cars, including mine, at the open ground, at me. It did not step out of the tree line. I stood at the edge of the parking lot and looked at it for approximately 30 seconds. Then Gretchen's truck turned into the parking lot entrance, and the headlights swept across the tree line, and when the light hit that section of timber, the shape was gone. She pulled up next to me. I got in the passenger seat. I sat there for a moment before I said anything. The truck was warm. There was a water bottle in the cup holder and a jacket on the back seat, and the radio was on at low volume, some midday talk program, and the ordinary domesticity of those details hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I had been in a sustained state of focused animal attention for the better part of an hour, and suddenly I was sitting in a truck with heated seats and a radio, and it took me a moment to bridge the gap. She looked at me. Gretchen has run enough miles with me that she knows what I look like at the end of a hard effort, the specific combination of physical depletion and satisfaction that a good run produces. What she was looking at now was not that, and she registered the difference immediately, and she had the good sense to wait, rather than fill the silence with questions. It was right there, I said finally. I pointed at the tree line through the windshield, at the edge, when your headlights swept across it. She looked. There was nothing there now, just trees and shadow and the flat light of a cloudy October afternoon. I told Gretchen the full account on the drive back to the city. She listened without interrupting, which is characteristic of her and which I was grateful for. When I finished, she was quiet for a minute. Then she said, "The clear cut. You said it went around the clear cut." "Yes," I said, and was back in position on the other side within 2 minutes. She drove for a while without saying anything more. Then, how wide was the clear cut? I told her, maybe 300 yards of open ground, mature timber set back significantly on both sides. She did the math out loud. 300 yards of open trail at a running pace, call it 90 seconds. For it to route around the obstruction in 90 seconds, it would have had to cover significantly more than 300 yards through dense second growth timber in the same time it took me to cross open ground at a running pace. That's fast, she said. Yes, I said. That was the entirety of our analysis. We drove the rest of the way in silence, and I was grateful for that too. I filed a report with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife the following week. The officer I spoke to was professional and took the account seriously, particularly the behavioral description, the pacing, the routing around the clear cut, the acceleration in the narrow section. He said it was consistent with some cougar tracking behavior, which I acknowledged and which I do not believe. He said they would flag the corridor for observation. He gave me a case number. That was uh that was the end of it, officially. I went back to the trail system 2 weeks later, and I spoke to a trail crew that was doing fall maintenance on the upper sections. 3 volunteers, all local, all familiar with that corridor for years. I described the location, the return trail, the narrow river section, the clear cut, and I described what had happened and watched their faces. 2 of them had no reaction. The third, an older man named Walt, who had been running and maintaining trails in that county for over 20 years, looked at me for a moment and then looked at the ground and then looked at me again. That stretch along the river, he said. Yes. He nodded slowly. We don't do solo maintenance on that section anymore, he said. Started doing it in pairs about 3 years ago. He paused. No specific incident, just a decision we made. He did not elaborate, and I did not press him. I have run that trail system 3 times since then. Different routes, staying on the exposed ridge sections, avoiding the return trail through the timber entirely. The ridge is fine. The open ground is fine. I have not gone back to the river section, and I do not plan to. I've thought a lot about what it was doing for those 6 miles. Not what it was I've made peace with, not knowing what it was, but what it was doing. What the 6 miles of parallel tracking meant in terms of intent, because it never came onto the trail. It never charged. It never closed the gap in a way that suggested it was going to make contact. It matched my pace and it stayed at a consistent distance, and it made a single, apparently strategic decision to route around an obstacle and resume position. That is a lot of patience and a lot of intelligence applied to a situation that never resolved into the obvious predatory outcome. I've come to believe it was learning the route, learning me specifically, my pace, my pattern, the way I moved through that terrain. The way it accelerated in the narrow section felt less like an attack building and more like testing, seeing how I responded to the decrease in distance, gathering information. That thought does not comfort me. Information gathered is information that can be used. I run that trail system with a partner. Now, on the rare occasions I go back, 2 people, open sections only, out before dark. I've told every trail runner I know who uses that corridor the same thing I'm going to tell you now. I run it with bear spray, and I run it knowing what I know now, which is that the timber on that return trail has something in it that understands open ground as a boundary and patience as a tool, and that is capable of tracking a moving target for 6 miles while staying just far enough back to remain invisible. Here's what I can tell you that is practical. If you run or hike trails with a long enclosed timber section, pay attention to what you hear off trail. Not every sound woods are full of sound. Pay attention to the sound that matches your pace and stops when you stop. Pay attention to the sound that resumes when you resume and accelerates when the trail narrows. Those are not the same as deer or bear or any of the normal things that share trail corridors with humans. And if you are running and you find yourself in a long, narrow section with dense timber close on one side, do not slow down. Do not stop to listen. Do not look into the trees. Keep your eyes on the trail ahead of you and run as fast as you can run, and do not stop until you are in the open. Open ground is your boundary. It knows this too. Stay in the light.